Okay, thanks for being patient. I think we have a quorum now, and I have started the recording of the meeting. So welcome to the March 31st meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Subcommittee. We have substantive things on the agenda today. We'll start, we'll go over that now and then get right into things. So first we'll have approval of the previous meeting minutes, which should be posted on the AOA Agency of Administration webpage for the Climate Council. There's potentially a co-chairs meetings update that's just kind of a standing item. Then we'll discuss the request for proposals that was sent out by Jane last night or this morning, and then the initial draft work plan. And those last two are the substantive items. We'll get to the next meeting, talk about the agenda for a minute there, and public comment before we adjourn.
TJ, a clarifying question?
Sure.
I didn't see the minutes on the agency website, and they're not linked in that agenda document. Is there another place we should be looking for those draft minutes?
Thank you. No, I realized that I didn't actually send them out like I normally do. I apologize for that. I thought they were posted to the webpage. So I wonder if folks haven't had a chance to review them. Well, I'll just say if you're the only one that hasn't reviewed them, then maybe we could move on. But if not, we may want to just stay the approval of those minutes until folks have had a chance to look at them. So are there others who haven't had a chance to look at the minutes?
Yeah, the minutes aren't on the website, TJ. I just looked. I'm not sure because I know that we approved them, and so I'm not sure what that is. So maybe we'll just kick those till next week.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. Let's do that. And I will note that the hopefully the 317 minutes, the revisions are up there. We did revise those per the discussion last week, and they were reapproved, and hopefully they'll, if they're not up there, they'll be up there soon. One other item I'd like to add as a standing item to the agenda is just some miscellaneous, I don't want to necessarily characterize them as always administrative. I think this week they might be, but miscellaneous items related to the general counsel work or our subcommittee work that for Jane to bring up, just so that we don't have to amend the agenda every time. I'll probably start adding that to the agenda, but I'd like to amend it this time to include that. So hearing no objections to that, why don't we dive into that now so we don't lose it and just go ahead and do those miscellaneous items, Jane, to the extent you have them.
Yeah, it was just the one thing, TJ, that you and I talked about, which is that as the subcommittees are now being finalized and sort of cementing in your membership, it would be great. I've sent to Leslie Ann and TJ what I have as the final list of your membership. I think I'm correct on that one, and unless I missed anybody, TJ or Leslie Ann, but it would be great if, as a member of the subcommittee, if you could send me a brief bio, and I can make this request in an email also. And if you're a counselor, and we already have your bio on the website, consider yourself not needing to participate in this task. But if you're a new member on this subcommittee who does not have a bio up on the website, I'm going to post the subcommittee names to the website and include a bio for all the members. So please keep it brief. We don't have administrative help yet, so I don't want to edit everybody's bio. So just a few sentences about the work that you do and the work that's relative to this committee would be really great for me to add. So let's say by next Friday, get me those, and I'll put that in an email to subcommittee members also as a reminder after this. But I just thought I'd put that out there now for you all. And that's it for today.
Great, thank you, Jane. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is, it's listed as co-chairs meetings update. The cross-sector subcommittee and science and data, which had one previously, has not had another meeting, so I don't have an update there. I do want to add to this agenda item just a potential discussion of maybe liaisons for other committees, because I think that's not the only committee we need to coordinate with. But before I do that, I just do want to ask Leslie Ann if you have had a chance to talk any more with Council Member Sue Minter about the Just Transitions Committee.
No, we have had no further opportunity for discussion as yet, neither with the Ag and Ecosystems group.
Right. Okay. So I want to just raise and maybe change the title of this standing agenda item, but the idea of having liaisons for to kind of coordinate with each committee. And you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be the co-chairs. I think we've identified Jared as a liaison for the cross-sector subcommittee, being on both committees. And Leslie Ann, you've reached out to Just Transitions already. I just want to kind of elevate that. There's two other subcommittees as well, and to the extent we should be coordinating, since I think the work that we are doing for the Science and Data Subcommittee touches on everybody else's work. So I'm kind of throwing that out there as an idea for feedback before soliciting volunteers. So don't be afraid to talk. You know, won't necessarily be volunteered.
I'll just add that is the approach that Just Transitions is taking, being a subcommittee like the Science and Data, being in service to the other subcommittees. The focus of some of their conversations this week will be to go beyond their in-reach that they're doing with cross-sector, and to think about sort of tapping liaisons for the other groups. And maybe that will mean somebody just sits in on this committee from there, and that wouldn't mean that you would have to task somebody to sit there. But beyond that, I think figuring out how to closely coordinate, especially with rural resilience and ag and ecosystems, would be really important.
Jared, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and this relates to the work plan discussion we'll have a little bit later, that I can imagine that the kind of need for that communication and coordination would ebb and flow depending on like the schedule that we're planning, especially in advance, leading up to some of the kind of meetings that you've proposed on the schedule. And I think it looks like a great work plan where we would, but I could just imagine that it might not be a kind of an even commitment of time, and it may be more in relation to where we stand on our timeline and work plan.
Right, thanks for that.
And I am not volunteering for any other subcommittee liaison, just to be clear.
So I wonder if there is you know, if anybody's background or skills lend themselves to rural resilience or any of the other subcommittees to play that liaison role. Jay, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute, Jay.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'd be interested in being a liaison with the rural resilience. I think some of my experience and perspectives on climate resilience related to water impacts in local communities could be helpful there. And seeing that work, I think it naturally fits my interest, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. and so we've got cross-sector covered, rural resilience. Any volunteers for the other subcommittees?
I don't want to, if there's somebody who is interested in serving as a liaison to ag and ecosystems, that would be great. I would also just note, though, that ag and ecosystems has identified Lauren Oates as their council member to also sit on cross-sector mitigation. And so she will be involved in that work, and I'll have a connection with her and hearing those updates there. And then we're also serving on the steering committee together, as well as Julie and Jane. So there's enough kind of points of contact with Lauren for updates from there that may not be as high of a priority if there's not somebody who wants to play that role, that we could fill it in other ways through points of contact at, with Lauren sitting on cross sector, or at the, since Julie and Jane and I end up talking with her in advance of and during and after the steering committee meetings as well.
Thank you for that, Jared. Jay, is that a new hand to raise again, or an old one?
Sorry, latent hand.
No problem.
Can I add one thing? I also think that Jared's first point about the work plan and points of intentional coordination, I think is quite clear with ag and ecosystems on some of your work plan duties. And there might just be a conscious invite and coordination in advance of those meetings for those particular issues. And I think that could work really well for that as well. Because I know they want to coordinate on things like the development of the carbon budget, and they see those as overlapping, responsibilities. So.
Right. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this up and took the prerogative as a co-chair to do so is just as we talk about the RFP, there's certain pieces that kind of overlap with the carbon budget, for example, that you just mentioned. And I want to make sure that we're doing a review that kind of brings in that type of thought. And I know, Jane, you're doing that as you have developed the RFP, and can talk about that more, but I think it would be, it wouldn't hurt at a minimum to just kind of have that other subcommittee member to subcommittee member point of interaction as well. Okay, so Leslie Ann, as I think you've already been reaching out to Just Transitions already, and I think if you're willing to continue for now to be that, that would be great. But I don't want to volunteer you for a task throughout if you're not willing.
No, that's fine. I think it makes sense. So happy to do so.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, and unless somebody else volunteers, I think we'll take the approach Jared suggested with the Ag Subcommittee. Okay, hearing no objections to that, thank you all. And I don't know that there's an immediate task, but I think we'll get into that as we talk about the work plan. Okay, so next on the agenda is the request for proposals and discussion there. So I will turn it over to Jane to tee that up.
Sure. Thank you, everybody. And still thank you first and foremost for Jared's original help getting TJI oriented, and then your work as a group last week and sort of thinking about how to reframe the components that were put out in the RFI and transition that into the RFP for technical services. So first and foremost, I just want to ground us in the understanding that this first RFP is really about sort of the modeling and work that's needed around the statutory requirements for the greenhouse gas emission requirements. And I just say that maybe more for the benefit of the other subcommittees who I know are starting to identify perhaps other technical analysis needs for their work. And that process will sort of be forthcoming for perhaps the use of this subcommittee to vet and consider what further analyses are needed outside of this body of work that's proposed here. I'll also just remind us all that this RFP is sort of built around the premise of the coordinated and intentional use of the LEAP model being developed for the comprehensive energy plan. So recognition of that is built into the RFP around the services and then also the experience that we're looking for with a consultant to have experience and understanding of the LEAP model. And so, you know, I didn't get a ton of feedback from you guys, and I also I have every intention, as TJ alluded to now sharing it with all of the subcommittees for input, and they all have it on their agenda this week. I will say that I have held back on sharing it with the Ag and Ecosystems Committee and the Rural Resilience Committee, knowing that we were going to have this discussion today. And I wanted to sort of pause and wait for any, you know, shocking revelations from all of you and any substantive changes before I sent it out to them also. So my hope is then this afternoon is to process what I hear from you all today and then further share it with the other subcommittees. It's also on the agenda for the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting tomorrow to discuss and consider, and I think that will be enlightening and further our understanding of what's needed as well. And so when I did share the memo that Jared prepared on behalf of TJ and I and the whole subcommittee around what our thinking was for input, I shared that with this subcommittee and the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. And I got, as I suggested, limited feedback, but some really valuable feedback from some really interested subcommittee members, especially on cross-sector, who have some really targeted expertise in this work of this kind of contractual expertise. So they were minor edits that built off of the RFI responses that we pulled together with our current understanding for what was needed. And then I'll just say that some initial work that's still ongoing within the agency, within A&R, to sort of understand is this RFP, as was suggested in the proposal around our understanding from the RFI responses, could sort of have three outcomes. It could have sort of the one mega consultant who can do it all and hit all of the points within the tasks and deliverables. It could have a lead contractor, as we've discussed, who also sort of put together the dream team of consultants to sort of deliver one package, or we could end up having this parsed out into separate smaller contracts. And I have checked in on that after TJ's suggestion that the Public Service Department often does it like that in an RFP. And that is, in fact, how we can do it. So one RFP with clear tasks and deliverables, and we can actually revise the language. And Megan O'Toole, who's on the call today, here with us today, is helping provide legal advice on that language that we received from purchasing to how to ensure that we craft the RFP appropriately so that any of those three outcomes could be the result of issuing this RFP and the proposals that we receive. So that's our hope. And what I really wanted to use our time with you all today is just ensuring that now that you have this and we're getting closer to pushing it out the door, are those tasks and deliverables what we want? Are we missing anything obvious, like really glaring at this point? And then we can fine tune what's in there as well. And then I also hoped that we could take a look at, and TJ has already identified an omission on my part, but look at the criteria around how we evaluate the contract, the proposals, I should say, and make sure that I've sort of accurately reflected the proportions that we want to give as we review them. And TJ, as we get to that, already mentioned one thing that I probably want in there, which is the approach that they put forward in their proposals on how they're going to accomplish the work. And that's something that they could have all the experience in the world, but if their approach isn't what we want them to take, then we would want to be able to evaluate them based on that. So that's something I'll work in. So I'm assuming that you all have it in front of you. I'm also happy, however you would like me to guide this, we could just have a general conversation, or I am happy to put it up and we can go through it point to point. I have it on my computer open. So whatever you all feel is best.
Go ahead, Jay.
Jay, yeah.
Two small grammar things. Just wanted to comment on. And I appreciate all the work. This is a lot of complexity and technical things to digest. One was, sorry, let me see it.
Would it be helpful to put it up for folks, or is it? Yeah, okay.
I think it's page 5. Bullet and proposal format.
Oh, not this one. Hold on. Oh, yeah, that one. Page 5.
Yeah. And the number 2 under proposal format. And past involvement does not need to be hyphenated.
Thank you.
And then there was one other small one. Under the criteria, there was a period after the first 25% under qualifications of the pilot of the project team.
Go right here. Thanks.
Yep, that's it.
Well, that if you guys all have that easy of comments for me, we're in good shape. But
Secretary.
do you want to?
Yeah, I was gonna say, no way, Jane. We're not letting you off the hook that easy.
I was like,
Come
wait,
on now.
I'm okay.
I have some wordsmithing ones, but I have a couple of bigger picture things that I'm hoping we could all discuss. The first of which you alluded to, I think, in your opening remarks, which is talking about the fact that this contract is really focused on greenhouse gas emissions. I guess I am worried there isn't a bright line between that and some of the work we need to do around particularly sequestration as we start to get into the overall carbon budget. And, you know, I'm interested in folks' thoughts about where to draw the line. I guess I would draw it on the side of, frankly, being broader, that I think it's really challenging in this space to potentially hand this book of work off to a different consultant and expect sort of an internally consistent set of results or a different project team. I don't know, and probably TJ and Jared, looking to the two of you as much as anyone, if there are consultants in this space that can do both of those things. But it felt, it gave, like, as I got to the end, I sort of was like, well, where's the sequestration piece? Because it is so just the greenhouse gas emissions piece, and would love to see this group discuss it. The other thing I had flagged is just sort of the role that's articulated for the Science and Data Subcommittee in the introduction to the scope of services.
I'm glad
and if that's the right role for this subcommittee to play, and or, you know, and or what the role of the steering committee is, and just sort of how involved in the kind of the day-to-day. To my mind, I envisioned the Science and Data Subcommittee sort of being a check on the work for a lot of the reasonableness tests, right? Where a data set would get produced, brought back to us, and we'd be the ones to look at it and sort of poke at it and ask questions about it. And if it met sort of what our expectations and what we had been anticipating, because I feel like this group has the expertise to gut check a lot of what may come back in terms of evaluations and modeling. But that's a bit of a different role than what's articulated in the scope of services. So those were the big picture things I had wanted to put on the table and hope we could wrestle with a little bit.
So I just want to thank you, Julie, because I actually meant to flag this because this was a question that I had for all of you. And so I don't want to detract from your question around how we tease out the sequestration component of the technical analysis, but I also do want to flag that maybe this would be an important discussion also to have, like you just suggested, because I started to think about this at the last minute and was trying to figure out how I spoke to the Science and Data Subcommittee and to the work of this contract or RFP and ultimately into the contract, because it's the role that the Just Transitions Committee wants to play with respect to the outreach and engagement, and really, and maybe we're not getting it right with that work yet either, knowing, like, thinking about how the role of the steering committee and the subcommittees work. But I would love to hear from all of you if this isn't the right language, and what it really is you all to be the receiver of sort of the preliminary results and a check along the way. I can certainly rework this language to reflect that. I can't see hands when I have this up too, so if folks are raising hands, just jump in and start talking.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a strong, I can see, you know, pros and cons to the existing approach or to a revised approach. A couple of the considerations that might be worth taking into account are kind of the, and I know we'll get to this later in the agenda, but is the proposed kind of work plan and timeline. It feels like there are a number of things that we outline there where we'll want to make sure that we are building off of or in sync with what's emerging from the hired consultants, and then any kind of framing or feedback that's originating from our work together through that would simultaneously be informing the work that they're doing. So I could see the benefit of, one of the things I like in this is kind of this regular, you know, twice a month kind of check-in, which to me in some ways is more appealing than the kind of more passive, like, review something after it's been drafted. I mean, I can imagine, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a consultant as well, and like having, you know, of course there'll be you as a consistent point of contact, Jane as the, you know, person that the contractor is reporting to, but in terms of, you know, when questions are emerging around design or definitions or kind of choices of modeling, I mean, I think we want to avoid micromanaging the work, but I think we also want to avoid being too distant from it. And I feel like your initial draft potentially strikes that good balance, where there is that semi-regular. It wouldn't be every time that we convene, but every other meeting. My initial reaction is that I like that. I do also, I want to be able to, for the full committee and staff to be able to continue following this thread of conversation, but when it's time, I do have a thought and want to follow up on Julie's good point around sequestration and where the carbon budget, where and how the carbon budget shows up in the RFP.
Yeah, for my part, I think I agree with you know, we want to have input not only into the finished product or even a draft product, but to the methodology that a contractor may be proposing. And so having the opportunity at the front and back end, I think makes a lot of sense without hopefully micromanaging. So kind of just restating and agreeing with what you said, Jared.
Yeah, I agree with Jared and TJ as well. I think this group is well suited to be that point of contact.
Great. Okay, well, I can suss that out with you, maybe Julie, offline a little bit, just to make sure we're comfortable with sort of the direction it's going with respect to A&R also being the one that holds the contract, and make sure that I have it in correctly with the role of the steering committee also and others. So, but it sounds like it, I mean, that was my thinking around informing methodology and also receiving preliminary results and having a back and forth dialogue with these folks. So for now, perhaps bi-monthly in some regard makes sense. So we can refine that later and move on to a more detailed conversation about making sure that the scope of technical services in here is right, and sort of shift to talking about the role of the sequestration work.
Yeah, I'm happy to work with you on that offline, Jay.
Jared, do you want to go
Yeah.
back to your comment then?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that Julie's point raises for me is that, some of the things that we identify in the RFP are just a very short bullet point, but are actually a very large
Like
scope
B.
work, like 1B.
Yeah.
And it might be useful to add some detail to that. I think there's other parts of this RFP where we devote a lot of text to it, but it may not end up being as much of a project as 1B is. And my sense is that the intent of that is to capture what you're pointing to, Secretary Moore. But that may be an area where some additional kind of sub bullets about what we mean by that could be helpful, so that we're all on the same page and they know what we're expecting. But I think that a key word there is development of. I mean, my sense, and I would defer, especially if Colin or others from DEC and ANR are on the call who have familiarity with the inventory, but my sense is that the extent to which we understand this now is basically with U.S. Forest Service data about kind of carbon sequestration from our forests, and that's declined from, I don't know, like what was it, like 5.8 million metric tons in 1990 as a carbon sink to more like 5 million metric tons in the latest inventory. So we've seen declined sequestration because of declining forest cover with forest fragmentation and development, et cetera. But my sense is that information can be further refined. There are other sources of sequestration that we're probably not accounting for that may be additional. And I think that'll be a key thing that we would want to incorporate here, is that we want to have a way of tracking sequestration that would be additional beyond what would happen in a kind of business as usual, or another scenario where so that we can be tracking the net change in that. I think that that's likely going to have to exist alongside the kind of main or the rest of the part of the inventory that's looking at gross emissions, but they need to be able to be talk to each other, because it looks like, as I look ahead to the reporting framework in the law, it looks like, I mentioned this in a memo that I sent to the committee and to this subcommittee and to cross-sector mitigation. As I read the Global Warming Solutions Act, and I am not a legal expert, but I don't see any place in the law where it speaks to either specifically gross or net emissions. But I think the working assumption we've had is that the 2025, 2030, and 2050 targets that speak to a % reduction in our emissions are speaking to gross emissions. However, there is this other part of the law that talks about getting to net zero, which would mean that we need a kind of a net emissions accounting framework, and we may even want, we'll see what. Yeah. So all that is to say, I think that this is a key and a big task in this, and I'd be happy to work with others to, it would be hard for me to do it on the fly, but maybe suggest a couple of other bullet points. I think that additionality piece, a means of tracking additionality, and would be a key one. And there's maybe others.
Can and maybe I'm ignorant enough on the understanding of all this to ask this question, but does it make sense then to pull the carbon budget component out from the greenhouse gas inventory methodology idea? No, it makes sense to leave it, because whoever's going to do the larger question would want to also do this component.
I guess my reaction is I think it needs to be part of this scope, but it may be the way to get the depth that's necessary. if there's agreement that sort of the evaluation of some of the sequestration pieces may well take place in this same contract.
Yes.
Like
I just
I'm not
wondered
sure
if
if
it
it
should be a
belongs under
standalone.
it. I don't know that I think part of the challenge is right now it's nested under the greenhouse gas emissions
Yes.
inventory, and to pull it out to have it still be part of the scope, but have it be a standalone item.
Yeah,
would be
that's
my
what I was actually asking. Sorry.
And I'll just say the reason that I nested it under was because in the existing inventory, we are tracking forest sequestration to a limited
Very limited.
degree. And so, I mean, I would of course defer to you, Secretary, more on this, given that it's your agency that's responsible for this. I guess the only thing that I would say on this is that I do think it's important that there's kind of transparent and aligned methodologies where those two ways of accounting can speak to each other and one be subtracted from the other for different reporting requirements.
Well, and Jared, I think you're flagging an important issue, and we need to make sure we're explicit about net versus gross emissions throughout. And that I was just grabbing my copy of the Global Warming Solutions Act. I'm pretty sure everything we're doing is supposed to be gross relative to gross emissions. And so while acknowledging the point you're making about the fact there is a modest amount of sequestration in that inventory, I think ultimately we may need to pull it out in order to be able to assess our attainment or compliance, or I'm not sure what the word is, with the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Or expand that component of it within the.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess personally, just while we're having this conversation, I think sort of the way the Global Warming Solutions Act looks at sequestration and even the net zero goal, that's not really a reach goal, right? From the perspective of the state of Vermont. Frankly, the emissions reduction stuff is so extremely challenging. And I wonder if ultimately we're not going to propose a bit of a different balance. And that's the other reason to my mind to keep those things hooked together, where maybe some of at the far end of this work, it may be that we need to look at the role sequestration plays in meeting our overall emissions targets, even if that's not entirely consistent with the way the act is framed, just as if nothing else, to provide a basis of comparison on cost.
I'll just note briefly, it was in the footnote of that prior memo I sent, so it may have been missed, and this was just rough back of the envelope calculations, but it did look to me like if it's possible that in meeting our gross emissions reduction requirements by 2030, we wouldn't be that far off from meeting the net zero requirement that isn't talked about until 2050.
I agree, and to me that's where that cost conversation also comes in, right? If we're really at net zero emissions and have put in place a framework that preserves those sequestration assets or conserves those sequestration assets, I think it needs to be part of the dialogue, which is the other reason I feel like that work needs to sort of live together.
Yeah.
Lou, it looked like your hand went up.
Yeah, thanks. Just a question for you, Secretary Moore. Are you thinking that it would include the kind of addressing the concept of additionality of evaluating the sequestration resources in Vermont? Are you thinking that it would that total calculation would include the additional sequestration measures as recommended by the VCC, or all of our forests and that thing?
I guess I would. Well, first, I would like all of you to call me Julie. Next, I think that to me that's still to be determined. We certainly have sequestration taking place right now. Some of it is less guaranteed going forward than other components of it, and then on top of that, as you I think are alluding to, there are some fairly significant opportunities to do more. whether it's looking at soil carbon levels or some of our forestry assets and management practices. And so I guess one of my concerns, and probably this is back at the Agency of Natural Resources level and the Department of Forests and Parks level, is I don't want to end up I want to make sure we're able to look holistically, not only at the greenhouse gas emissions reduction pieces, but also at the sequestration opportunities, and ensure that we're maximizing the use of our forest assets in particular, but soil health too, in service of these overall goals. So and I don't want to miss opportunities to do more better in that space, because we're unintentionally myopic on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thanks.
All right.
It makes perfect sense, and it's also a tie into a lot of the work that's probably going to come out of the Ag and Ecosystems group, which makes it even more critical that we have some of these discussions with that group now as we're building out some of this, so we don't miss out on those potential co-benefits a little bit later down the line.
I agree. I see the resilience work is in some ways its own thing, right? Like it's the some of the climate modeling that I assume will come out of what we're looking at in terms of emissions inventories. But the reality of it is our climate is so driven by things that are happening outside Vermont, as opposed to the greenhouse gas emissions reduction work, that I think it's okay to have that be its own animal. These two, I feel like, are so potentially intimately related. I don't want them to lose track of one another as we go through the work.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a good segue to a substantive item that I wanted to bring up. And it's not in any of the comments that I provided here, I don't think. Jane, if you scroll up to the first page, it's kind of the second bullet.
Oh, yeah.
One more bullet down. So the second bullet there, identifying the current and plausible range of climate change impacts, et cetera. That, as Leslie Ann just noted, is really probably critical in that kind of interaction between what we do as a subcommittee and what the rural resilience group does, in that they need to know what's coming at them in terms of climate change impacts in order to plan to be resilient for them. And so can you talk a little bit more about that subject, I guess, or maybe it's for the open committee, and whether it should be in this scope of work a little bit more explicitly?
I mean, we talked. Yeah.
Who are you pointing to, TJ? Point that finger well.
I was teeing it up for Jane, I think, and full disclosure, Jane and I talked about this briefly about an hour ago, but
well, I think that, as TJ and I discussed, and I'll share here with you all, is that I don't think we've done a good job currently in the way the technical analysis scope is written here at addressing that question. And so it sort of leaves the door open for either including it here more explicitly within the scope of services, or considering this a discrete portion of the work that we could grant out in another form to meet those needs within the climate action plan. And so maybe I'll tee that up for the other climate experts on this committee to speak to sort of how, or the preference of how we could advance that component of the work.
So I don't know what to say at this point, because I had a conversation with Matt Chapman earlier today. And one of the things that he had said to me was, if you get to the point where we're talking about services where you could be potentially a bidder for that, then you should recuse yourself. And so it's a very, very fine line for me to say anything at this point. But what I could say is that you have a meteorologist and a climatologist on this subcommittee. As the Vermont State climatologist, I have access to a lot of regional writ large and national writ large, data sets, different types of data, different types of interpretations that speak to climate science that I could bring to bear as part of my role as being state climatologist. And so as soon as Matt has had a chance to talk to the other folks that he's going to be talking to about how to approach that, I think we'd be able to move forward on that part of the discussion. But for me, it's a very, very fine line at this point that I do not want to overstep. So if Julie has any piece that she wants to add to that, or if Megan, if she's still online, wants to add to that, please feel free, because all of this is public record.
Can I say,
But it looks like Jared has his hand up.
I have just a clarifying question for context, and I assume that this is directed to Leslie Ann, but others may know. Do we have an update on the timeline for publication of the next Vermont climate assessment? I know that UVM has been working on that over the past little while, and I think it had been delayed, but I guess one of the reasons I ask about that is because I think it would be a really important thing for us to build on or a starting point for some of this understanding. I guess I also, at the risk of making an analogy that isn't totally appropriate, this set of questions strikes me a little bit as similar to the conversation we had about the social cost of carbon, which is the extent to which we address this question. We're going to be standing on the shoulders and drawing on, you know, a very kind of robust, intensive set of work that has happened nationally and regionally. And then the key question for us is, you know, within, whether it's the social cost of carbon within the ranges they've identified, or nationally and regionally within the kind of ranges that have been identified for kind of climate impacts for Vermont, it's then that subset of questions of what do we need additional detail on that is specific to us that we wouldn't get from some of these either broader regional reports or what's already being used for Vermont. I'm really curious to hear, especially what you have to say about that, Leslie Ann.
Okay, so I think a couple ways of answering that, and part of it is we're setting up a plan that's looking towards the future and looking towards making sure that the reductions that we put in place, or the recommendations for the reductions that we put in place, are future looking. Whenever we use assessments are looking back towards the recent past. And so to the extent that we are using the either observations for right now or the models of what is going to be in place by the time we get to 2025, 2030, 2050, that's where using a lot of that national and regional stuff. And when I say regional, I mean like Northeast Regional Climate Center at Cornell, the work that they're doing, which is future looking. And if we're trying to make sure that we're building the stuff for Vermont that's based on the best science, then that's where that is going to be coming out of. And I think whenever we do assessment, whether it's the Vermont climate assessment or the national climate assessment, that sort of looks back at the past in terms of what have the impacts been and not what the impact's going to be. And that's where there's that fine line as to if we're going to do it and we're going to do it right, then let's plan for the future. While keeping in mind what's gone on in the past, but it's the planning for the future. It's sort of like when VTrans is using information to do the sizing of the culverts, using the NOAA Atlas 14, which takes into account the non-stationarity of the climate, is going to put them in a better place than using a TP40, which is using information from 1940, right? So the sizing of the culverts uses that current information and looking forward, whereas TP40 is using information that's like 50 years old.
I may be wrong. I may be recalling this from another report, but my recollection was that in previous Vermont climate assessments, there was some forward-looking thing. I feel like I remember a map where it said, you know, on business as usual trajectories of emissions and expected amounts of warming, and it showed kind of, the state of Vermont basically moving south, and like we could expect a climate by, I don't know what it was, I can't remember the exact numbers, by 2040 that's the equivalent of North Carolina today.
I know which map you're talking about. It's the one that came out of the second National Climate Assessment.
Okay.
And so it's like 15 years old, that particular map.
Yeah.
And so because I was the lead author for the fourth National Climate Assessment, I know what some of the existing stuff is and what some of the stuff that's sort of coming down the pike. And that's why I'm sort of trying to push us towards using some of that information. And Jay just put in a little thing in the chat. Jay, did you want to turn on your mic and just say what it is you put into the chat there?
Yeah, I'm just connecting dots. We're doing work with the Northview Weather, which I own and operate with the electric utilities, Velco, and we work with Green Mountain Power and Vermont Electric Cooperative to look at extreme weather changes as related to power outages. But as part of that work, we have a general assessment and some climate work that we've done. I think it's probably the most comprehensive look at climate change in Vermont through 2049, and this is going to be released publicly in June once we go through a few review processes. So that, and I just want to make sure everyone's aware of it, and happy to share knowledge and that information as it's helpful.
Thanks, Jay.
That's great. So I guess to keep us on track a little bit and getting through the components of the RFP, I guess I'll just call the question and sort of suggest, do you all feel like we need to go back and look at the RFP and those tasks and deliverables to pull in some of the climate assessment work into this RFP? Or are we good with this as is, with recognition that this committee will work on it, and when and if it generates sort of more work outside of this committee that is needed, that we could consider a separate component, either in a grant or some other form of work to get us there? Go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, it raises to me, and I'd be really curious to hear from you, Jane, and you, Julie, about this, is that I imagine as we go, both kind of issues like this, or once we get drafts back, or the deliverables from the consultants, that there are pieces that we're going to want to add to or go deeper on than what's in this initial RFP or scope. And so I guess from like a management perspective, I'm curious how you may be thinking about how much of like the technical support budget gets allocated to this initial RFP versus how much gets held in reserve for technical consulting that will emerge later and that is not yet fully identified. And in that scenario where we're needing to put out potentially future or additional RFPs, is it kind of as pieces of work get identified? I imagine that could be really complicated. Or do we want to identify like a moment out in time, say, a couple of months or a month after this one, where there may be some pieces that just aren't really ready to be framed up for this initial RFP, but that we may need in the future? I guess it's more of a question of
resources. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one that I posed to our business office this morning a little bit to start us thinking about that, because I know what we have for budget for technical analyses. I also don't know how this contract how this RFP will end up being awarded, whether it's a single contract or multiple small contracts, and therefore I didn't know what in our other RFPs that we've done for the Global Warming Solutions Act work, we've put in anticipated amounts to be awarded for the facilitation one and the outreach and engagement, but that was because we budgeted it and we had a reasonable understanding of what they should cost. So in this case, I don't anticipate putting in a number, but I've asked that of our business manager so that if that's accurate, and therefore really relying on the consultants to tell us what it costs to do this work, and then therefore making an informed decision on who we hire based on that. I think our understanding and expertise, like what I know a little bit already, is that we should have money left over from what we have. but that fine line balance of what is still going to need to be contracted later and what isn't, that's a sort of going to be a management situation that will be sort of making informed decisions as we go and learn more about cost. And to speak to your other point around sort of like ongoing contractual needs, I really think that this is getting us to the bulk of the contractual technical analysis. But I also think that we've outlined a process for the next month for some thoughtful deliberations by this committee, as well as the other subcommittees more extensively, to think about what we missed, and then have a process for the Climate Council or the steering committee to review and consider what's needed really for this climate action plan. Go ahead, Julie, to further that.
Yeah, I just was going to add a couple of things. Because we're going through a full RFP process, there's an opportunity to amend the contract, and I think that that's probably something we'll need to do as we go through time. But that's why I think there's a lot of value in the conversation we were having about sequestration and frankly the climate assessment, and trying to make sure we sort of set the parameters well, because at least under the principles of state contracting, it's easier to go deeper. It's harder to go wider than what we go out with initially, because it's difficult then to justify to the folks that weren't selected that we didn't select a contractor for one job and end up giving them a different job. Mm-hmm. So that part, I think we do have some degree of control over, and just wanted to make clear that we can amend the contract as we go along. To go deeper, but it would be challenging to go wider. And so just to keep that in mind, as we're thinking about the scope of services we're soliciting bids on.
That was helpful. Thank you. Okay, did that get us to then being able to sort of address in particular the question around the climate assessment work right now? And then we can go back to, I think I still feel like I just want to call to question also the way we frame the carbon budget. What I've heard, and I just want to reiterate from all of you, is that yes, we want it in this scope of services, but perhaps I pull it out from underneath and give it some more detail, recognizing that it'll have to be interactive with the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, if that's possible, or just check in with you all if you still want it embedded, or if that is in fact what we're all hearing.
So I have a point of clarification,
Sure.
and this probably goes back to something that I had written in a message to a bunch of folks. When you say climate assessment, Jane, what do you mean exactly?
Well, I'm getting at that point up above in the in the beginning that TJ just drew our attention to. Sorry, I'll just read it right from it. Here. This is so sorry that I perhaps, as you can call me on this and explain better, but I think I'm perhaps speaking to a tool that gets us to sort of the recognition of this bullet that is it showing for all of you right now? What I highlighted? Can't tell if I'm sharing anymore or not.
You're sharing, but I don't think we are looking at page 3 of 6.
I have two.
Now your cursor's moving on the one we can see.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that bullet right there that I was just re-highlighted, identifying the current and plausible range of climate change impacts and evaluating strategies and programs that build resilience.
We're on a different one than you, Jane, but.
Sorry. Well, I'll just read it then for you all. Make sure I'm on. I was referring to the point up on page 1 that TJ was referring to, which is that one of the tasks associated with the responsibility and charges is identifying the current and plausible range of climate change impacts and evaluating strategies and programs that build resilience in the capacity of individuals, communities, and the natural and built systems to withstand and recover from the current and anticipated effects of climate change. So it's speaking to that bullet and whether or not we're getting the right technical analyses to actually do just that.
So I would just offer, as the person who I think
wrote that section originally for the first couple of RFPs. I don't know that that needs to be, those are the charges to the Climate Council, not necessarily what we need out of this contract. And I think it's appropriate to have it here. I think it provides context. And when assuming Jane, this isn't something you have added or you and TJ have added, but my recollection is I provided this largely as framing for both the facilitation and the outreach and engagement contracts, so that folks would know what it was we were trying to accomplish writ large.
Yeah.
Maybe it doesn't have, maybe it's less appropriate here because we are trying to get services in a narrower band, or maybe it's just we need to add a sentence or two to the introduction to those sets of bullets to sort of describe that overall, this is what the charge to the climate is in the statute. And then make sure that we're clear that what we're seeking support for, what the technical service support contract that this RFP reflects is a subset.
Yep, that makes sense. Thanks.
And if somebody else wrote that, you're all free to tell me I'm out of my mind.
Not on public record, Julie.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Leslie.
So I'm assuming I am back on the screen that you guys can all see now, and my cursor is moving on that. And so I'm back down under where the actual the scope of services. And you all can see that. And we're back to discussing 1B, and then should move down to the others before we run out of time, if there are comments.
Yeah.
Did we reach agreement that 1B should be pulled out to become its own?
That's what I asked, yeah.
Okay. I think that is appropriate and would allow us then to do as I think Jared had suggested, and build that out with some additional detail too.
Yeah, although in that scenario, if we're pulling it out, then we're probably talking less about a whole carbon budget, because the sources are already going to be identified in kind of A above in terms of the review of the existing inventory. And really what this would be development of a way to assess and track carbon sinks that could then be added to our kind of emissions inventory focused on GHG sources to enable us to avoid net emissions. But I guess what I'm trying to avoid is suggesting that there is a task where we're identifying emission sources in two different ways for two different tracking reporting frameworks.
And I think that's an important point, and just the language needs to be clear as we build that out.
Yeah, and I mean, and we've talked about the potential, like TJ highlighted it here, and we're already having separate kind of conversations about what with the greenhouse gas inventory methodology can be done by DEC specifically, and what can't be and has to be in a contract. And perhaps some of this work spoken to in number 1 is just handled in-house, and what's happening is we're considering what we're going to augment the work that DEC already does outside of it. Okay, if we've exhausted that one, let's just make sure, does anybody have any outstanding comments on the other items within the scope of services? Besides TJ, who's provided them, which you can all see. I didn't mean to share that one.
I have one more comment, which is, at least personally, I think we should articulate and express preference for some sort of one-stop shop. I'm not necessarily, to me, it could be one
entity that could do all of the work, or a team led by somebody who can do all of the work. But and this may be inside A&R a conversation, I think the idea of having multiple contractors that we then become responsible for coordinating the work of is just something we don't have the capacity to take on right now. And so I think in the selection criteria, I don't know that we need to preclude people from providing a partial response, but I think we should at least have a stated express preference for proposals that can accomplish the full scope of work, or can address the full scope of work.
Yeah. I'm all for that. So if anybody has an objection, make it strong.
I just the only piece of that that I'll just raise is to the extent that there's a piece of this that is can be maybe differentiated from some of the other items. A lot of it overlaps, but I'll just go back to, even though it seems like we're not putting it in here right now, but the impact on the climate impacts going forward. You know, that seems like a different skill set, a different scope of work than somebody like, I don't know, ICF or one of those other big energy modeling firms that could do a lot of the rest of this work. And I wouldn't want to preclude an entity that has kind of that specific expertise that could actually potentially do a great job on that piece of it, but doesn't necessarily, have the REMI chops, the economic modeling chops, or one other, another piece of it. And I just get concerned about that. And I deal with lots of contracts with the Department of Public Service, and I totally get the contracting, I'll say nightmare, nightmare that it can be. But I also think that there could be some value. But I suppose as long as we're not precluding a bid there, I just wouldn't want to discourage some good potential services that we could get.
Yeah, the ideal would be somebody with that kind of narrow targeted expertise to team up, right? And so anything we can do to promote either a single entity or a team that comes to us as a team, I think will serve us well in the long term. But I get what you're saying, TJ. And I think there's a way we can get some words on the page that don't preclude it, but just encourage people to look for ways to team up outside of our contract.
That was a question that I had that I'd be curious, especially TJ and Julie, given that I think you have a lot more experience with state contracts than I do, and perhaps others as well. Is this question of, like, when I read through the 15 RFIs, it's easy for me to say, oh, they would be great at this piece. They would be great at this piece. And I don't know to what degree they're kind of aware of each other, and to what degree we just have to basically assess the teams that they're identifying and proposing versus is there any avenue that is available or appropriate to try and say, well, we liked this piece of this proposed, like, would you consider working together? Like, that gets, I can imagine that would get awkward. I don't know what the scenarios or pathways are for that, but I think that it's very unlikely, well, I'll reserve judgment, but I think it's probably unlikely that there's one consultant that's going to be able to do all of this. There's some very specific technical expertise that I can imagine a well-formed team would draw on one organization more than another. And I just wonder how you think about or approach that situation.
Well, from my perspective, I think there are ways to address that, whether we kind of explicitly say, do you want to sign up for kind of a list so that everybody knows who each other are, or it could even be done after the fact, but I think there's some other hurdles to jump there. But I guess I'll leave it. In the interest of time, I'll just leave it at that. I think there's ways around it, or to facilitate that, I should say.
Okay, I think that's fine. And I've noted that, TJ, your comment, and then also recognize that Julie and I can consider how best to frame that with the language in the way we review and rank proposals to ensure that we can encourage that. I'll just comment on, I was just looking at where there, I thought I wanted to make sure we got to, but just make sure that everybody concurs. These were some thoughtful comments from Christine, and she sits, I'll just say, on cross-sector mitigation. And TJ, you did seem to echo that the questions that she raises here really seem pertinent to the work of cross-sector mitigation. And maybe I'll just table this unless folks would like to add anything now, Christine's comments and concerns, and highlight that in particular for cross-sector tomorrow to consider to make sure that's correct. I'll pause there and make sure, and then before I go to my last point, and make sure nobody has anything to add to that right now.
I think it'll be good to discuss tomorrow.
Okay, and then finally, this comment, TJ, you and I talked about this offline before getting on, and I think this is some of the sustenance of what the steering committee is going to consider tomorrow around what are we all sort of moving towards with respect to consensus around what is actually required in this climate action plan, and is this language of like a vision for 2050 appropriate? It's probably not, even if we get to the understanding that less specificity is clearly going to be available and inevitable in this climate action plan, the first one for 2050, I think we're probably getting to something more than a vision in the way that we're sort of teeing up the conversation of the outline and how we put forward the first climate action plan. So maybe I'll just reflect that this isn't the right way to reflect this here, but it's more about the level of specificity moving away from 2025 and further out.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and folks know better than me the details of the statute, so I'm comfortable leaving it at that. Thank you.
Great. And then just want to highlight if anybody else has any other comments to sort of the selection criteria or more broadly about the RFP for now. And I will not preclude any other grammar edits or anything else. You can just send me offline if you'd like, since you all have it in Word.
Just one quick point, Jane. And maybe too specific, but it seems that we would probably not be evaluating any proposals for which the project team was not qualified, and that we might want to see that they've demonstrated that qualification by having formally done something like this at the state level. So I don't know if that's worth considering.
Are you suggesting that that the first two bullets go hand in hand and aren't separated?
I guess I'm just trying to stress the importance that we want them to understand that we would really prefer them to have done this kind of analysis before.
Yeah, it's funny. I talked about this a little bit outside of this meeting too, but some folks actually saw having worked at the state level on other climate action plans as a handicap, maybe because they would just say, this is the approach that worked for Maine, so let's do it in Vermont, and maybe wouldn't bring their creative thinking to it. But I really feel strongly that having worked at and agree that having worked at a state level in the development of a climate action plan and the resources for that is really important to this work, bringing that expertise, but not everybody felt that way.
I will say, just on that point briefly, that there have been a number of articles, news articles, opinion articles that have kind of analyzed and assessed the climate action plans coming out of other states. I've seen some written about Connecticut recently and Maine, and I think a common criticism of them has been that they are, they're not plans, they're visions. They're kind of too vague and not specific and actionable enough to actually add up to the requirements. And I think So I hear that criticism that we wouldn't want to end up with a plan that is broad brush and isn't actually an actionable strategy, especially because the difference for us as compared to all these other states is that we have a 2025 requirement that we need to meet, whereas most of these other places that have done plans, the first requirement that they have to meet isn't until 2030. So I think that pushes even more the importance of a detailed plan, actionable plan, especially for 2025, coming out of this in a way that I don't think any other state has done yet. So there may be a limited availability to draw on what other states have, not that we shouldn't, I mean, especially I think for the 2030 components. But I just want to say that I hear that, and I think it's an important consideration, and that there are some ways that we're going to have to do this probably a little bit differently than other states have done if we're going to be successful.
Yeah. Any other feedback at this point? And the door isn't closed, obviously. Please do, by the end of this week, if you have other specific comments or feedback or reflections after thinking about it further, just send it along.
Great. Thank you, Jane. And, you know, I was looking at the time during that discussion, but no, understanding that this was the time sensitive piece, I wanted to give it as much time as it needed today. So, you know, I'm recognizing that there's only 13 minutes left in our scheduled time. I'm hoping that we can keep a quorum at least for a couple of minutes after. But does it, would folks find it valuable to at least orient themselves, to orient to the work plan that I drafted? Take 5 minutes to do that, or should we just move on? What?
I will have to drop off at 3 o'clock. I have another commitment. I don't know about others.
And TJ, I think out of respect for the time and effort that you put into it, for us to also have that time and space to digest it and have a meaningful conversation, I think would be the better way forward, as opposed to trying to rush through it right now.
Right. I wasn't thinking we'd be able to have any substantive conversation, but just to high level, you know, orient. But it's pretty straightforward. I'll just say that up front, it's I won't pull it up, but it's just a initial shot at kind of scheduling out the different tasks from different topic areas, and then a little more specificity on what we might cover. And it goes week by week, and then when you open it up and look at it, you'll see that it kind of, the specificity trails off as we get a couple months out, as you might expect. So it's meant to be kind of a living work plan, if you will. And I guess I'll just stop there for the orientation. Jay, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so just a quick comment on the questions on the right-hand side of that. Were those the questions that you came up with, or from a larger group, and maybe that's places of conversation? I was just wondering if you could provide some clarity on that.
Yeah, sure. That was I had a back and forth with Richard, you know, separately, and he had raised a couple of those questions and a couple of others, frankly, that I included in some of the details, so I didn't call them out separately. So those were just kind of an initial list of extra thoughts for people to think about.
And I think because we haven't had that time to actually look at it closely, and maybe see how it kind of fits with various schedules, I know I personally would like to be able to digest and you know, really chew and ruminate on stuff, especially since the word climate modeling is in there with some timelines that may not be right. I know you volunteered to do my grading, okay? But apart from that.
Well, yeah, and absolutely. It was an initial shot. You know, something's got to go first. So I threw
You throw us under the bus. Thanks a lot.
Yes, yeah. So any and all feedback, very much welcome here.
I would just say quickly, TJ, I think this is a great start, and I look forward to discussing it more next week. But I really appreciate how you identified as an early task, I think the week of April 14th, the focus on having kind of an overview of our current inventory methodology, what we know about the inputs, the assumptions, the models that are used, and then where are there kind of gaps or kind of areas where there are questions or possible areas for possible kind of improvement that are identified by DEC. I would be happy to be part of kind of conversations leading up to that. And I would of course defer to Julie and team at ANR and DEC in terms of what is possible, but I do think that it makes sense for that kind of piece of the work plan to be as early as possible, because so much else of what we do depends on that kind of common knowledge and getting clarity and consistency around the definitions and the approaches, and we'll want to have a good solid grounding in that for when both we're assessing the RFPs and for when that work starts with a contractor, because I think that that'll be a key early part of the work that they do, and we want to be able to hit the ground running with them on that. Potentially, you also said, TJ, that may be handled more in-house, but I think we've got to dig into it first before we can really know that. I'm right now, I'm saying I'm glad you identified that early on. I agree with that.
Yeah, and there are a lot of questions there. I wasn't able to even confirm that that April 14th date would even work. So for the DEC team, although they're certainly willing to come and present, and additional guidance, as you suggested, onto what exactly the high level presentation went to the full climate council. A more detailed, if there's more certain areas where more details warranted, I think that would be helpful to articulate so they could provide that when the time comes. The other thing I'll mention is that early on in there's a line item for common terminology. I think it came up today, talking about net or gross emissions with what we're really talking about for reductions. Climate assessment was another one that Leslie Ann raised, is really defining that term. I had put that as a point of discussion for April 7th, which is our next meeting. I'm not sure how far we'll get on that, but if folks could just think about any pieces that they think should be well defined, clearly articulated over the next week, and bring those, potential undefined or not well defined terms, and then maybe even propose a definition for them and bring that to the next subcommittee meeting. That would be great.
Richard raised his hand. First.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, hi. As I said earlier, I'm really, really glad to see this work plan. And I'm looking forward to the discussion on the 14th about the existing greenhouse gas inventory. And I sure hope we can do it. You all might give some thought to how to frame that conversation. I mean, that greenhouse gas inventory is quite large and complex. And maybe Colin and others can identify ahead of time what some of the key issues are, some of the key decision points that had to be made, or that were made in developing the existing inventory, because I think those will probably be topics that we will want clarity on.
Great, that's great feedback, and I'll just point out April 14th was a date that I came up with. I need to check with Colin and folks, and I have, but they're checking. But then also it will definitely happen. It's just a matter of it's on the 14th or the 21st or when it is. And that's your point about highlighting what the key decision points are is really helpful. Thank you. Okay, Jane, I think you were gonna.
Oh yeah. Well, I was just gonna highlight that Commissioner Walk has flagged this as a topic for the cross-sector meeting tomorrow. It's on their agenda. I'm not 100% where he's going with that topic quite yet for tomorrow's discussion, but cross-sector is starting to talk about the greenhouse gas inventory tomorrow. And then I just wanted to flag also for you all that the commonality and definitions, that's something many groups or subcommittees are struggling with. And I haven't shared this broadly, but like the Just Transitions Committee has decided to host a forum, I guess I will call it, that next Wednesday night, grounding and inviting academics who work in that space in to sort of ground their work in definitions and common language. So I think it's great that you guys are starting to do that, and I'm sure the expertise sits here to think about those definitions, but that I'm sure could take a little bit of work. And if there's a role for me to help you in sort of compiling that or working with other state staff to compile that for you all ahead of next week's meeting, I'm happy to help with that.
Great, thank you. So I think two things. One, if folks, if it's easier to make comments on the scope of work, I could send out a Word document where you could do track changes. That may be easier to kind of reflect any comments. I guess I would ask if you send those by Monday at noon, then I could turn those around and send something out by Tuesday evening in advance of our next meeting. And if you can't get to it by then, you can just bring it up at the meeting as well. Then, and also similarly for the definitions, if you have any definitions you want to send and coordinate, you could send those. I'm going to ask you to copy Jane on that as well, and then the two of us will try and figure out the best path forward there. To aggregate and redistribute. And then that goes into the next meeting where this will be the main topic of the next meeting. Those two things, definitions and the work plan. I should ask, I said that as a statement and I didn't mean that. Are there other topics that folks would like to raise at the next meeting or we should cover next Wednesday?
I mean, I would defer to Jane on how the timeline may have changed, but my understanding was that would also be the meeting to kind of do a final kind of check and approval on the RFP going out. Is that right?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Hopefully there won't be much more needed by then, but
yeah.
I might put time limits on our discussions next week. Okay. Any other comments from subcommittee members or staff on what we've covered today? Okay. I guess we will open it up for public comment. Mark.
Thanks, TJ. I wanted to comment on the remarks that Secretary Moore made on sequestration. According to the United Nations, changing our land practices alone, and this is a quote, changing our land practices alone could deliver 30% of the emissions reductions that we need to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. The Global Warming Solutions Act acknowledges the importance of some of what the UN calls nature-based solutions, but they're not included in any of the law's hard targets. It's not difficult to see how this could result in policies and a plan that that are disastrously counterproductive. I hope that you'll include the impacts of these nature-based solutions in your budget, your carbon budget, and that you'll advise the legislature that the Global Warming Solutions Act should be amended to give these natural impacts equal status with gross emissions reductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. George Gross, please.
Hi. I had 3 topics I wanted to address. First off, you may or may not be aware at the federal level, President Biden on January of this year issued an order directing the National Academy of Science to develop the societal cost, not just of carbon, but also of nitrous oxide and methane. In other words, the number is no longer one number, it's a 3-tuple. They are expected to deliver that as a recommendation by June of next year. And it would be going through rulemaking, of course, at the EPA. And so far, nothing in the RFP or any other conversation I've heard here would seem to suggest folks were looking at that as a potential guidance for how you should steer your development of your inventory. In that model, it's likely that they will have discount rates that are different than those you might be accustomed to using. The specifics you can find in reports that have been issued by the National Academy of Science in this area. And also probably be societal cost as a function of which year you're looking at. So it's a little more elaborate. And it definitely would, I think, change what you might use as your guidepost for achieving a cost of damages from climate-induced chaos. Second item, a large part of my experience professionally as an ERDAD architect was in the context of a product development center that actually had charged to develop a new product line to merge DSL technology with the internet. And why I bring that up is that many of the planning paradigms and how you organize the structure of how you attack a problem are developed in a way that has specific milestones, answer questions like who's doing what, by what point, how much money is it going to cost. And those are all the earmarks of an actionable or executable plan. I'm concerned that the discussions so far haven't really connected the climate action plan towards that. And Jared's point, I think, is well taken. A plan should be executable if you want to have good prospects. And along with that, a source of funding for it, an idea, an estimate of the scale of it as well. What kind of timetables you would expect to have things started. These are all pieces of that puzzle that I would expect your consultants could help you develop that in a way that all comes together as what we call an architecture. In the world I was working in, it was an architecture for a new product line. In the world you're in, it's an energy policy architecture. Third thing I wanted to bring up, looking at the RFP language, I'm concerned that list item 1 that speaks to the greenhouse gas inventory does not explicitly reference the portion of the Global Warming Solutions Act language that requires life cycle greenhouse gas accounting. I'd like to suggest consider having that accounting done for the major fuel types and energy sources, and have that be basically pronounced to a composite inventory that has the 3 different types of gases in it, not just an aggregate or conjugated carbon dioxide equivalent, but would recognize that the impending requirement to have both carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Those are the dominant greenhouse gases. Thank you. Comment. Oh, one last thing I should mention in passing. I note that the Planning Council has developed a public comment section. And also a place that, as I look at it, unfortunately, right now, it seems to be not operational. When I go to the area that shows where the comments in that file, I try to find documents that we had filed back in March 9th. I'm not able to find them. The search box doesn't seem to accept any inputs to find those documents. I've tried it on 2 different browsers, so I'm pretty concerned there might be a bug floating around in there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Looks like Steve Crowley, please.
Hi, thanks very much. And thanks for all your work, and particularly Jane, thanks for getting that portal up and running, or almost up and running, I guess. I want to make a few quick points. One is to pick up on what George just spoke about, which is that section. I just want to read a sentence out of the law. It says, Vermont shall reduce emissions of greenhouse gases from within geographical boundaries of the state and those emissions outside the boundaries of the state that are caused by energy in Vermont. And I think that it's not totally clear, but it's pretty clear. You know, I don't think we're talking about butterfly flapping its wings in China here. It's not that kind of causality. But, you know, you look back at the last year and you know, a year ago, as people parked their cars all over the country, pretty quickly, oil production stopped. It slowed down a whole lot. And to me, that's cause and effect. And to me, that is the kind of cause and effect that is implied by this language. And I could go through examples of how that might apply, but you know, the pipelines, the storage, the processing, all that is not, the work's been done. It doesn't have to be redone. But that's part of what I believe this language calls for. And I think your RFP may miss that. I think you talk about going with what you've done before, or possibly a much wider scope, but I think this is in between and it's pretty specific. So I hope that you will consider that as you go forward with the RFP and with your future discussions. A second quick point is that there are some missing things in the way we do things now with the inventory. One is we count renewable energy credits as zero carbon, and I don't think they are. In fact, I'm not even sure that they belong under the Global Warming Solutions Act. They don't exist. They're not in the language. They are in the language of the Renewable Energy Standard, but not here. So there's a lot of assumption as people talk about what we do with our electric sector, particularly in the cross-sector mitigation committee, that assumes that those RECs are zero carbon and we don't have to think about them anymore. So I think that's really important underlying going forward. The third quick point is that the law references offsets and alternative reduction mechanisms, and that I think probably implies some kind of a system that gets set up to recognize what those are and how to account for those. There are criteria that are involved, and it might be a useful thing to get some help figuring out, how do you set that system up and how do you apply those criteria? What have people done previously with that? I think the language came from Reggie initially, which has done something like this. It's not a real parallel, but it's close. The final point I want to bring up is this concept of additionality, which I think is absolutely critical. It's critical on a planetary scale. This law was based and a lot of the thinking that we have now is based on Paris Agreement and the IPCC report that followed that. And the notion is we have a crisis, and what we have been doing so far has led us to this crisis, and that's kind of status quo. What we have to do going forward is additional. So anything that we've done in the past is not additional. It's status quo. And I think that certainly includes the forests. And they're essential. If it weren't for the forests, we would have been, in a lot of trouble. We're already in trouble, but we would have been in much worse trouble a long time ago. But that's status quo. So we can't just say that all the forests of Vermont suddenly are all brand new and now they're going to start reducing carbon. They've been doing it. So we have to do better. We have to do more. And I agree with Mr. Whitworth's comment that we have to, that there's a lot of potential there and it's really critical, and we don't solve the problem without it, but it has to be additional to what we're doing now. So additionality is a critical concept, and I think it's additional in a bunch of ways. Additional when we think about our credits, are the recs we get from Canada, are they additional? Is there additionality to that? It's one of the criteria for the offsets that has. So additionality is a really important concept, and you might look for help figuring out what that means. Certainly figure it out yourselves as we go forward. But that's all I have. Thank you very much for all your work.
Thank you, Steve and George and Mark. Excellent comments, all of you. It's really helpful. Thank you for sticking with us through the meeting and providing comment. So with that, Leslie Ann, any departing words?
No, I think it was a great set of discussions today. I think we took the time and space needed to actually hammer out a lot of the key issues that we needed to address with the RFP, and I look forward to doing the same with the work plan next week, and knowing that it's going to change, it's going to be tweaked, and let's continue moving on with trying to get all these various pieces in place. So as always, I thank everybody who has contributed, especially our members of the public, for raising the bar in terms of their conversation and inputs, and wish you all a very good week. It's a special week for a lot of folks, and so have a great week, great weekend, everybody, and see you next week.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.